We are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Andrew Weil, who is recognized worldwide as perhaps the definitive expert on drugs, recreational, addictive, and medical. Dr. Weil is a research associate in ethnopharmacology at the Harvard Botanical Museum. He's an adjunct professor of addiction studies at Arizona State University. He is president of the Beneficial Plant Research Association, and he is the author of Natural Mind, Marriage of the Sun and Moon, and his new book, which has just been published by Houghton Mifflin, Drugs, Chocolate to Morphine, copies of which we hope to have available tomorrow. In the fall, he's going to have a new book out on health and healing, and I think we're in every way privileged and fortunate to have speaking with us tonight Dr. Andrew Weil.
Good evening. I'm going to depart from what the program says I'm going to talk about. First, because I think many of you have heard me talk about shamans and use of hallucinogenic plants in Central and South America, and also because I would rather talk more generally about the role of psychoactive substances in human life throughout history. I have been involved in the study of psychoactive plants and drugs for over 20 years, and in that time there are three things that I have learned about them. Some of them, the last one in particular, has crystallized only in the past 2 years. But I'd like to just tell you what those three things are. They're fairly simply stated, but it took me a long time to learn them. The first is that there are no good and or bad drugs. That drugs are what we make of them. They have good and bad uses. And that if you look around the world, the clearest pattern that you find is that every human culture is involved with drugs, with one or more. The only possible exception are the Eskimos, who had the misfortune not to be able to grow drug plants and had to wait for us to give them alcohol, which they now abuse terribly. I know of no culture in the world at present or at any time in the past that has not been heavily involved with one or more psychoactive substances. But the usual pattern is that a culture will approve the use of one or a small number, and at the same time disapprove the use of all the rest, especially those that other cultures use. But what's very interesting is that there's no agreement from culture to culture as to which are the good ones and which are the bad ones. If you are a Muslim, alcohol is the big bad drug. But the use of opium may be tolerated, the use of hashish may be tolerated. There is even an encouraged legitimate use in many Muslim countries of a stimulant leaf called khat, which is the closest thing that nature produces to amphetamine. Some years ago I was in Ethiopia with an anthropological expedition, which is one of the major growing and using areas of khat. In that country, it is the Muslim minority, which is the economic and socially deprived class, that choose khat, and the dominant Christians drink alcohol. And the Christians are trying to stamp out the use of khat as an evil drug which leads to amotivational syndrome, or however they phrase it, it's the same thing. And they have invited the World Health Organization to come in and solve this terrible drug problem in their country. If you are a mainstream American today, alcohol and caffeine and tobacco are accepted drugs, to the point that they're not even recognized for the drugs they are, despite the fact that alcohol, any way you look at it, is the most toxic and most dangerous of all psychoactive drugs. In any sense, in terms of medical toxicity, behavioral toxicity, there is no other drug for which the association between crime and violence is so clear-cut, or serious medical toxicity. And tobacco, in the form of cigarettes, is the most addictive of all drugs. There is no drug that comes close to the addictiveness of cigarettes in terms of how fast the addiction forms and how difficult it is to break, and in what a high percentage of people who try that substance get hooked. Almost any drug you look at, you can find a substantial number of regular users who are not addicted. In the case of alcohol, maybe 90% of regular users of alcohol are not addicted. In the case of heroin and opiates, I don't know, there's no statistics, but I would guess that anywhere from 30 to 50% of regular users are not truly addicted, although some of them may get to be over time. But how many cigarette smokers do you know who can smoke one or two a day or one or two a week? They exist, but they're very rare. I think probably under 1%. And despite that fact, and despite the fact that that is one of the most obnoxious of drug habits in that it exposes non-users to the drug, and nothing else does that except marijuana, and there's very little public use of that. Despite that fact, and despite the fact that the majority of cigarette addicts begin their addiction as teenagers, 90% of them, and that is well known, the industry that purveys that drug is supported by public tax money. I don't know whether any of you know this, but the columns on the Senate side of the Capitol building in Washington are decorated with tobacco leaves as a gesture of the economic importance of that crop in the economy of the United States, which happened after the growth of the modern cigarette industry, which led to addiction because it produced a cigarette that could be inhaled deeply and often, and created an industry whose product was in total demand, led to the economic reconstruction of the South after the Civil War, and that is where that economic debt was owed. Well, given that, the extent of that, and the blindness that exists about the nature of that substance and what it is, you can just see the level of irrationality that pervades our culture. All the talk about drug dealing and drug dealers and pushers. I mean, what could be a more flagrant example of drug pushing than public support of that industry? Again, I say there are no good drugs or no bad drugs. I think that tobacco may have legitimate uses, but in the form of cigarettes, its addictiveness is so great that my advice to a young person would be that if you're dying to know what tobacco is, chew it. Put some in your mouth or put powdered tobacco in your nose. That will tell you all you need to know about tobacco, and you'll have time to decide what you want to do about it. But if you experiment with cigarettes, the chances are overwhelming that you will be an addict before you know what's happened to you, and that's a very difficult addiction to break. And that's an example of what I would include in a real drug education course, which I see very little of in this culture. Now, just to go on with this little survey, if, however, you are in a subculture in this country, let's take say, an Indian in the Native American church, alcohol is, again, a terrible thing. The Native American church, which uses peyote sacramentally and ritualistically, is the only approach other than Alcoholics Anonymous that I know of that has any success with alcoholism, which is notoriously resistant to any other form of treatment. So in that group, peyote is not a drug. If you call it a drug, that's a very bad thing to say about peyote. I mean, drugs are always what other people use. If you are in the Native American church, peyote is a sacrament or it's medicine, and tobacco is also. Tobacco is considered a sacrament, which is used along with peyote in a ritual setting, but alcohol is terrible. Marijuana is likely to be terrible. LSD is likely to be terrible. It's white man's drug, not a natural sacrament. Well, you find this pattern again and again. You could go around. I know certain subcultures in this country that value the use of marijuana and all of the psychedelic drugs, the indoles and phenethylamines, but are very condemning of things like Quaalude and barbiturates and medical drugs and sometimes coffee, tobacco, and alcohol. I know medical doctors that think that any products of the pharmaceutical industry are okay. They're medicines, but anything illegal is terrible and damaging. I mean, this is where the origin of much drug research that sets out to prove the harmfulness of these unaccepted substances, which has led to terrible blunders in the medical literature. I think the classic of which was the dissemination of the story that LSD broke chromosomes. That was published in the country's leading medical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, and endorsed editorially in that same issue with a very prominent editorial saying this was a highly important article that everybody should be aware of. It was terrible research. And what was terrible about it should have been apparent at the time the article was submitted. And legitimate experiments to test the hypotheses that LSD broke chromosomes were not done until sometime later, and they consistently showed that there was no effect on chromosomes. That research was difficult to get published, did not generate publicity in the media, and to this day, 10 years later, I meet people that think LSD has adverse effects on genetic material, which it doesn't at all. That just is an example of how even medical scientists can get involved in the same kind of irrationality and prejudice about good drugs and bad drugs. So that the ones that you accept are okay and the ones everybody else uses are terrible. Well, this is, I say, one thing that I have learned. I don't think there is such a thing as a good drug or a bad drug. I think you can use any drug wisely or stupidly. And any drug that you care to name, I can show you people that use it intelligently. Maybe for some drugs that will be a small percentage of users. And I can show you people that use it stupidly. Even drugs that have terrible reputations. Look at You know, heroin has an awful reputation in this culture. I can show you people who use heroin productively, for whom it reduces anxiety, enables them to function normally socially, and lead productive lives. I don't know what percentage of total users they are. Obviously, many other people don't do that, and they use it abusively. I see a great failure in the world in general to distinguish between drug use and drug abuse, and that is a variant on this theme of good and bad drugs.